Hey now, Shota, you're an all-star. That's right, Cubs fan Shota Imanaga is heading to the Lone Star State for the all-star game next week. Leila Rahimi, James Neveau, we are here to talk about that because, frankly, it is a bright spot on the bleak landscape that is the Chicago Cubs 2024 season. Miss Rahimi, you are fresh off of NASCAR coverage all week long. I would assume that you have plenty of glorious stories from rainy and soggy Grant Park. How'd you enjoy the experience, and how'd your 4th of July weekend go?
Yeah, my 4th of July weekend, of course, was spent working with the big Chicago street race. Got to see a lot of people, got to go behind the scenes a little bit. There's nothing cooler than walking down pit road when it's in the middle of the street in the city on Columbus. That is a wild feeling. It was a lot of fun just to experience. Everybody hated the rain. We know that much, but
Mm-hmm.
it was still really cool. I was really thinking that maybe Tyler Reddick representing that 45 car and the Michael Jordan brand, the Jumpman car, was going to win, but Alex Bowman was the winner, and that's a cool story too. He hadn't won a race since 2022,
Mm-hmm.
so still an enjoyable process overall. And one Chicago baseball team was represented on a car, but it wasn't the Cubs; it was the White Sox. So
Yep.
that was also interesting branding to see. And
I,
as far
yep.
as what were you going to say, James? I'm sorry.
I literally, you brought up the Michael Jordan company, and I was literally going to bring up that Alex Bowman spun out one of their drivers and then got door slammed at the end of the race. And so clearly the number 23 car, he felt bad about wrecking him, but Michael Jordan's company did indeed make their presence felt on the streets of Chicago for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. That was Bubba Wallace, and it seemed
Mm-hmm.
like a reasonable retort. The two have not talked, but Bowman did say after the race that he was embarrassed about what happened in that situation with Bubba, which makes sense. I
Mm-hmm.
understand that. It's a street race. This is not your typical race, especially not in the rain, and then with the shortening of it all because of daylight. So understandable, but yeah, there was some definitely interesting video that came along with that. And then Tyler Reddick, his teammate, close, but ends up
Yep.
finishing second.
You know what? We talk all the time about the unwritten rules of baseball, and now we get to deal with the unwritten rules of NASCAR and what constitutes something that deserves a door slam. But that is a topic for another podcast, Miss Rahimi. Instead, we shall go back to our all-star conversation. Shota Imanaga, the first Cubs rookie to make the all-star game. Can you remember the last one?
Chris Bryant.
That is correct. Chris Bryant in 2015. Shota has joined that club. Not a very big club, shockingly, for the Chicago Cubs of rookies to make the All-Star game. 0.84 ERA in his first 9 starts with the team. That was an MLB record. On the season, a 3.16 ERA would be 225 if you took away the 10 runs he gave up against the New York Mets. But Leila, gotta say, Shota Imanaga has been everything advertised since he came to the Cubs. And more importantly, I think he's really endeared himself to the fans of the city just with the way he's handled himself and the personality that he has shown. He has rapidly become a real fan favorite. And when you think about an event like the MLB All-Star Game and how fan-driven it really should be, ideally, I feel like Shota Imanaga absolutely fits that bill 1,000%. I thought this was a slam dunk, obvious pick by Major League Baseball.
Absolutely. You can't argue with the numbers. And aside from the one clunker that you mentioned, those numbers speak for themselves. The other possible clunker was the one he had against the White Sox. So you take
Mm-hmm.
those two out, and then his numbers become even more impressive. So to say that he has been the bright spot this season is an incredible understatement. Where would they be without him? Think
Yeah.
about that. Think about how many games they've won when he started. He's appeared in 16 games so far for the team, and they've needed every single time he's gone out there.
Yeah, and I mean, you think about it, like two of his starts, he's made 16 this year. He gave up 17 earned runs in those 2 starts. And so divvy it up. That's 15 earned runs in the other 14 outings. That's pretty good, according to my sources at Major League Baseball. I just think that Shota has been just this glue that has really helped the team out quite a bit this season. They've obviously struggled to hit the ball. He's been able to withstand a lot of that and to kind of persevere through those difficulties. I mean, you just can't say enough good things, enough positive things about him. I don't think he's going to end up winning National League Rookie of the Year. I think that Paul Skeens is probably going to end up running away and hiding with that thing if he keeps throwing the ball the way he has. How insane is it, by the way? We had a guy who got picked number 1 in the last year's draft and is now an MLB All-Star already this season. Like that, just utterly crazy to me thinking about that. But not to take away from Shota, just merely saying what a massive youth movement we are really seeing with these All-Star game rosters that we have this season.
I couldn't agree more. And Paul Skeens, when you consider the run he was on previous to that in the College World Series as well with LSU,
Mm-hmm.
just and that they're both in the Central too. That's a
Yeah.
story in and of itself to me that they're both in the same division and they're doing what they're doing. One, of course, via free agency, good money that the Cubs spent, and then
Mm-hmm.
the other one because of the draft. But man, there's a there's a story to be told there about the value of rookies, whether it's an older rookie like Imanaga or a younger one like Skeens. But you
Mm-hmm.
know, even Skeens to me, yes, he's a rookie. Yes, what he's doing is amazing, but also there's a lot of miles on an arm from a guy who's from a program like LSU where you're pitching starting in February, you're playing games, and that's a practically professional program when you consider how they treat their starters, how they treat their players, the amount of games you end up playing thanks to a regional, a super regional, and then a CWS. So there's something to be said for the level of experience you get on a team like that as well. Vanderbilt, clearly kind of the same idea for me.
Mm-hmm.
Those guys are like practically pros. They're still in college and they're going to get drafted, but they're as close as you can get to not being rookies as rookies, if that makes sense.
I mean, the dude threw 122 innings just in college last season and then had very limited sprinkling of action in the minor leagues. Only pitched, I think it ended up being 6 innings for the Pirates system. And then immediately came out, started 7 games down in AAA for Indianapolis, and then found himself in the show. And you look at that and you kind of, there's obviously only one Paul Skeens right now, but I think ultimately does show the attitude that baseball teams have, that they would rather a guy with that kind of skill set be throwing those pitches and logging those innings in the major leagues. And I think, Leila, your point about the innings load, you look at a guy like Garrett Crochet, who is now transitioning from relief to starting rotation for the White Sox. You're kind of seeing how the value of being able to build up your arm and to pitch that many innings and then to immediately be able to come into Major League Baseball. And so it's just all a part of kind of that youth movement and monitoring the usage of pitchers. But getting this back to Shota, I mean, you look at what the Cubs rotation as a whole has been able to do this season. I thought it ended up being appropriate that they ended up choosing a starting pitcher to represent this team in the All-Star game.
Right. We've talked about it. Starting pitching has been the most consistent, relatively speaking. It has been the most reliable, Shota being the best example. And the fact that he's a rookie really is just icing on the cake here for me. You take that out, and it's a huge factor, but he's had a fabulous season regardless. And I really appreciate how he rebounded from, say, that game against the Brewers in late May, how he
Yep.
rebounded again from what happened against the Mets. There's really something to be said for that at this point in his career. You ask, has the league found him out with that velocity on the fastball? But the answer so far is no. And there have been adjustments made, so it's surely appreciated.
And I think the attitude has never wavered either. And I think that's something you're going to see in a player who's been around the block as many times as he has, where just the lows and the highs, he's very consistent attitude toward everything that he does. And I do think that and hope ultimately that that's kind of infectious for some of the younger guys that are in that clubhouse on a regular basis. And I think that to a man, I think they would all say in that clubhouse that he is that kind of steadying presence. And you can definitely tell the respect that they have for him. You saw the video the Cubs posted yesterday. If you haven't watched it, would encourage you to do so. Craig Counsell informing the group that Shota had been chosen to the All-Star game. And you can tell, the appreciation those guys have. And I'd love that he said he was going to go to the All-Star game and stick his chest out and be proud that he represents the Chicago Cubs. I thought that was great red meat for the fans, and just again a reflection of the kind of dude that Shota Imanaga is.
Agree completely, and he should be proud of his work. There's no doubt about that. What can you
Speaking
say? Enjoy your break, Shota. You deserved it.
Mm-hmm. And we'll see if he ends up pitching. I believe he's set to go, I think, on Saturday for the Cubs. And so I think that's going to be an interesting thing to see whether or not they will pitch him in the All-Star game. Kind of hope that they do. I think it would definitely be a good showcase for him. The question I had for you, Leila, was one that, the Cubs are obviously not doing so hot in the standings, but they do have other guys who are at least on the fringe, that borderline of potential all-star players. And I wanted to throw out a name to you. And then, of course, if you have any names to throw back, certainly would love that. But there is a Cubs player who has nearly double the WAR of Pete Alonso this season, has a better batting average, better on base percentage, comparable slugging percentage, does have 7 fewer home runs, but that's an 81 fewer plate appearances. Michael Busch's stats compare very favorably to Pete Alonso, who was selected for the All-Star game. Was that a guy, Leila, that maybe should have gotten some consideration in the infield for the National League?
As much as this show likes Pete Alonso, he has not had the same season he's typically had.
You're not wrong.
So I never discredit, frankly, East Coast bias when it comes to All-Stars. Never.
Yeah.
Especially when it's a New York team.
Mm-hmm.
Like, to me, that's just, you're either going to get credit for past performance if your current performance isn't good, and if it is good, then you're going to get credit for that, so you're getting credit regardless. Maybe that's a little too easy to paint that picture, and I still think Pete Alonso would be an absolute improvement on a team like the Cubs.
Mm-hmm.
But I think there's no doubt that Michael Busch has had a solid, if not, I would say for him, like an A, grade season for the first half of the year, given the expectation. But
Mm-hmm.
I would say Pete Alonso has not, but they still give credit for, a B minus or a C plus when it comes to performance for an all-star game.
There also may have been other considerations too, like getting a 2-time home run derby champ to be involved in that again, which Pete Alonso will be participating in the home run derby. Of course, you do have to have a representative for every team, but then in that instance, I'm curious why they wouldn't have chosen Francisco Lindor, who's having a really strong season for the Mets. And honestly, if they were going to go with a different infielder, I thought that a guy like Christian Walker from the Diamondbacks would have been a great selection too, but just wanted to throw out a little bit of Michael Busch love to kind of reflect on the season that he has been having in case Cubs fans needed to contextualize that a little bit. Also wanted to throw out the name Ian Happ to you as well. When you compare him to the other 4 guys who were chosen as all-star reserves in the outfield, you've got Elliot Ramos, Brian Reynolds, Teoscar Hernandez, Jackson Merrill. Ian Happ's stats are not wildly off base with what those guys are doing. The home runs are comparable, except for Hernandez has 19 for the Dodgers this season. The WAR's also very comparable. Brian Reynolds is really good this season, has a 2.8 WAR so far. But you look at the stats, and honestly, Ian Happ, for all the struggles that he's had, and his batting average is still only 241 on the year, a lot of his other statistics do stack up relatively well with some of these guys that got chosen.
Well, and I think Ian Happ is probably the victim of bad timing, right? Mm-hmm. Because we've really seen a resurgence in his offensive numbers over the past couple of weeks. So maybe if that had happened earlier, mm-hmm. and we saw the performance that we've seen a little earlier, like say 2 weeks earlier, maybe 3, then mm-hmm. would we be talking about an all-star? I think so. The other part of this is, once again, Pittsburgh, credit to the Pirates, man, for getting more than one all-star.
Yeah.
But I feel like Teoscar Hernandez is somebody who people wanted to see be an all-star. People wanted to believe in his potential. And of course, things look better when you're a Dodger and you have protection in your lineup and you're able to get things done that you might not think you could have gotten done before. So I feel like that's surely a piece of it. The NL West well represented when you consider mm-hmm. those outfielders for sure. But yeah, I think it more is crediting Ian Happ's production from both sides of the plate, frankly. over what I'd say the past 2.5 weeks, James. What
Mhm.
would you draw the stretch out to be for you? 3?
It's getting closer to that, and I think that we had kind of started to see like rumblings of it, like, and it is just so apparent when you look at his statistics how consistent he is on a year in year out basis, right? You look at his stats at the end of each season, they're generally pretty much in line, right? Like you can typically pencil in what you're going to get out of Ian Happ, and I just think that recently you've started to see the power that we really weren't seeing earlier in the season. His slugging percentage is up quite a bit in recent weeks, and you saw him at Wrigley on the 4th of July hit 2 home runs, both sides of the plate against the Philadelphia Phillies, something he's only done one other time in his career. And it just goes to show that Ian Happ, for all of the people in Chicago who maybe don't think that he's an elite left fielder, he certainly belongs in the conversation among the top left fielders in the game. And I think that's why the Cubs gave him that 3-year deal and the trade protection clause in that contract. I think there's something to be said about that level of consistency and then that level of defense that you end up getting from Ian Happ. And so even if you don't necessarily buy the argument that he is comparable to the 4 reserve outfielders that are representing the National League, I think it at least shows what level he should be kind of viewed at in the context of the rest of Major League Baseball.
His OPS is 799.
It's not
Take
bad.
that into consideration on this Cubs team.
Mm-hmm.
Man, you'll take that for sure. The 4-for-4 game makes everything look better, absolutely. But he's only had 2 games this month where he hasn't had a hit. It's
That's
just
pretty good.
the power numbers just are not as sexy. He's got 13 home runs. It's respectable, but
Mm-hmm.
the problem is the leaders and how that gets skewed among them. But to me, I feel like Ian Happ is on OPS alone. You could make a solid argument. So I don't. I mean, I feel like more than anything, you're just happy to see his bat wake up at a time where the Cubs absolutely needed it. Is it too little, too late for,
Mm.
unfortunately, what we might see, at the All-Star break? I'm not saying Hap goes anywhere. I'm just saying, do you care as much if the team becomes sellers at the trade deadline?
Did want to give fans one other bit of incentive to watch the Futures game next week. I believe the game is on, or sorry, later this week. The game is on Saturday down in Texas. There will be several Cubs prospects that will participate in the game. Matt Shaw, that we've talked about extensively on this podcast, has 10 home runs, 19 stolen bases in Double-A this season. Lots of talk about him maybe being the future third baseman of the Chicago Cubs. He will be participating in the game. Outfielder Owen Casey, a top 50 prospect in baseball, has a ton of extra base hits in AAA Iowa this season, one of the youngest players in AAA, which I think really speaks volumes to the speed with which he is developing. He's got a really good OPS as well. I believe it's somewhere around 820 this season. So he'll be definitely a guy to watch in that Futures game. And then for you real prospect nerds out there, Moises Ballesteros, who recently was promoted to AAA by the Cubs, will participate in something they're calling the Skills Showcase, which is going to have targeted hitting, a call your shot competition, and a swing for the fences competition. It will be points based, and they will determine a winner on that. And so plenty of Cubs representation in that Futures game if you guys want to watch that on Saturday night. Leila, I kind of wish they would do the skills competition like that for the Major League Baseball guys too. That sounds like a lot of fun.
Call your shot sounds awesome.
Yeah,
That is backyard baseball at its finest, isn't it?
it
I
is.
I love that
They're
idea.
They literally pitched it as inspired by baseball video games. And if you're going to have an exhibition like this, why on earth wouldn't you want to do something fun like that? I love that concept, and I cannot wait to see it put into action down in Texas. And I can't wait to see Moises Ballesteros be part of it.
I know he's somebody a lot of people are really looking forward to seeing more of. He seems to be the biggest name we discuss right now as far as prospects are concerned. Unfortunately, there's partially a reason for that. I know we were going to get to it, but the Brennan Davis story is just perplexing.
Mm.
But as far as Ballesteros is concerned and the Cubs representatives in the Futures game or the Futures game activities, it's still a compliment. It's still a nod. It's still something that you put on a resume, so to speak.
Hmm.
And at least we get another look at somebody who I think is still someone who fetches a lot of discussion and I think optimism and hope when it comes to what he could possibly do once he is in the show.
I would certainly agree with that. And I think you bringing up Brennan Davis, I mean, we could have gone, there were probably two directions we could go at this point, but I think the injury update portion of the program probably going to ultimately be important here because you kind of mentioned some of the Cubs prospects that have been dealing with injuries this season. You look at the Cade Hortons of the world, the Caleb Killians of the world, etc. Really unfortunate news this week for Brennan Davis. Suffered a fracture in his back, which he's had back issues in the past, and unfortunately, it looks like he's probably going to be done for the season with that injury. One would have to imagine. Just a real downer for a guy who was having a really solid bounce back season, looked healthy for the first time in forever, and then to deal with that kind of setback, it was really unfortunate hearing that news this week that he's dealing with that back fracture.
Yeah, and I think leaving us all with the question of what happened.
Yeah.
So, is it something that has been the situation? Maybe we just didn't know.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, maybe there's something there. That is to talk about that for a baseball player, any athlete is just really confounding, and especially somebody in a sport that doesn't have a lot of contact is even more concerning.
Yeah, and it's been the back issues have been very consistent for him. I mean, he was having a really strong season in Iowa. You can kind of look at the 229 batting average and say, oh, well, not really that great of a season. But you look at the 390 on base percentage, the 933 OPS, like he was having a really good season and a guy who you maybe could have seen get called up at some point, especially if the Cubs end up selling at the trade deadline. One would imagine that Brennan Davis could get a little bit of run, but once again, that is all on hold. We have to deal with another injury issue with him. And yeah, it's just really unfortunate the speed bumps that his career has kind of taken. And you just kind of wonder at some point what exactly the future is going to be with him in this particular organization and whether or not he can get healthy enough to really make a sustained run at a spot on the big league club.
Well, and how long are you talking about being out for as well? Yeah,
Yeah.
this seems to me to be something that would definitely extend into spring training.
Yeah, one would
I don't
think.
know.
Yeah, honest, and they really have not provided any sort of detail on that. The one thing again that really concerns me about it is that this is not the first time he's dealt with back issues. He had the sciatic issue, I believe it was last season. He talked about that pretty extensively on Marquee. This is not a new phenomenon for him, and so it's one of those things that you're like, is this going to continue to linger? Is he going to be more susceptible to back issues in the future? All of these questions, I'm sure, are being fielded by Cubs medical personnel right now, and we don't have a ton of answers, unfortunately, about what we can expect.
No, no. So, unfortunately, a little Brennan Davis update for you. It's just something that happened within the past week since we had discussed anything on the podcast. So I figured
Yeah,
I would mention it.
and I appreciate that a lot. I love that you brought it up in our text thread earlier today. Definitely wishing Brennan all the best, and I guess it is kind of I'll call it a transition point that we can go to another injury that is perhaps more on the absurd side of the ledger, and that is the battle between Colten Brewer and the wall in the dugout at Wrigley Field. Spoiler
Himself.
alert, the dugout wall won. He is out for at least 2 months after breaking his non-pitching hand, punching in a dugout on Saturday. In the spirit of that, I did end up writing a post today on NBC Chicago about weird injuries that Cubs players have sustained over the years. I mentioned the Sammy Sosa sprained ligament in his back in 2004 from a sneezing fit. I mentioned Kerry Wood slipping while getting out of a hot tub in 2007. You
Oh,
had
I
you,
forgot about
you had
that one.
Kyle, Kyle Farnsworth in his epic battle with the electric fan that cost him a month of action in the 2004 season. I mentioned Coy Hill slicing off his thumb with a table saw. All sorts of fun, weird injuries that have happened to the Cubs over the years. But I thought that Colten had a really good perspective on that, where he felt like he let down his fans, his friends, his family, people in Chicago. I thought Craig Counsell struck a very measured tone with it, saying that it was obviously a mistake, but also one that it's really easy to get caught up in the emotions involved in losing a lot of games and pitching poorly on a big stage. Obviously, he got forced into action on Saturday when Kyle Hendricks left the game with back tightness, but it's just one of those things that you have to end up being in control of your emotions. And unfortunately, for a guy like Colten Brewer, who's going to kind of be one of those tweeners on the roster and kind of bounce back and forth between Iowa and Chicago, you just ultimately can't let it get the best of you. And unfortunately, he did end up doing that. And, here's hoping that he does end up pulling a lesson from it. And, we are kind of allowed to have a little bit of fun with the absurdity of the situation, but definitely worth remembering that there is a human being involved in that fracas between player and wall.
Yes, but there was also a wall. So that's where we end up with this, unfortunately. I do feel like I thought about this, and I'm not trying to trivialize his injury. But I'm like, okay, well, is it better or worse that you're still out because it was your non-pitching hand? If you had punched the wall with your pitching hand, would you have broken your hand? Because you likely would have had better form. I don't know. That's a sports hypothetical I didn't think I'd find myself in. But I do agree that, unfortunately, the karma was swift and the punishment was obvious. What else do you say when somebody did something like that to themselves? They know. We've all hit a wall in frustration, haven't we?
Sure. Oh, of course. I think everybody is like,
I've definitely punched a wall at work in frustration. Not NBC.
I've kicked an IKEA box in frustration after building furniture. So I get the vibe. It's one of those things where you're like, well, this is just awful. So I'm not really sure what that says about me as a person, but there we are. That's the place that we're in on the Cubs Talk podcast, talking about the motivations involved of hitting a sponsored wall in a dugout. Anyway, we've had enough of the frivolity and the absurdity of life here on Cubs Talk. We're going to end the show with a little bit more of a somber topic, I suppose, and one that I think is going to ultimately dominate conversation for several more weeks as we head toward the July 30th trade deadline this year. Kind of unusual. We've had it bounce between the 31st and August 1st. This year it is July 30th. That is the date the Cubs have to decide whether or not they want to be sellers or buyers. Leila, there's still uncertainty, quote unquote, with Jed Hoyer on whether or not he will be a seller at the deadline. But if he does, there have been several names floated, including by Bob Nightingale, who said that guys like Nico Hoerner, Cody Bellinger, and Jameson Taillon could all be on the trade block. What do you make of those kind of rumors? And I'm really curious, what would you think if the Cubs decided to trade a guy like Nico Hoerner?
Okay. The Nico Hoerner name was one that really made me bristle. The upside on Nico Hoerner is still very high. He's young. He likely signs another contract with your team. It's your fault you decided to sign him to only a 3-year deal. I understand. We've talked about his offensive struggles on the show. Mm-hmm. However, I think that guy with protection in the lineup, like legit protection, not whatever we're seeing right now out of this team, is a different dude. And Cody Bellinger, I get it. You took a flyer on him. It was a very player-friendly contract. The flyer was last year. It was not this year. This time around, you don't even know if you're going to have another option situation with him. He's losing money on that end for himself right now, but that's one where the contract is so flexible. Yeah, I get it. I get why a team would want to trade for him, and I think the Cubs could probably fetch a lot. Even though that contract is what it is with the flexibility and the option after this year, I still think it's because teams need offense so badly, you could really fetch something there. Jameson Taillon, to me, that one falls in the category of, if you really want to fix what you think is wrong, you're going to have to make some expensive and hard decisions. Mm-hmm. And to some people, that may be Nico Hoerner, right? But to me, it's the quality, at least one more year left on a contract, because he had a 4-year deal, right?
All right. Are you talking about Taillon?
Yes.
Yes, he is
Second
indeed
year of the
second
4-year
four-year
deal.
deal.
So you have 2 more years of control, even though it was high at the time for his resume, now reasonably priced. And I just wonder if that's the type of deal you make to really try to invest in your future. That's one of those where
Yeah,
you say, this is what a team needs, but also if you play that right, unlike the Yu Darvish trade, then you might get something back that's immediately a return.
right.
But the
I
problem is your pitching staff is so injured. Who's going to run out there? Hayden Wisniewski's made adjustments, and we haven't even talked about that on the show. Those are encouraging, by the way, even though I don't care
absolutely.
about the strikeout numbers with him right now. Work on something different. Work on the contact aspect. But at least with the Jameson Tyler, it's like, man, you're going to have to make some tough calls here and give up value that has actually been a bright spot for your team. So what are you really willing to give up?
I 1000% agree with that. And I think the Tyon thing is a great example because it's a matter of I'm wondering if there's maybe a little bit of wishful thinking on the part of the Cubs where they're hoping that somebody takes those remaining 2 years off their deal. You're going to have to eat money on that contract if you try to move Jameson Tyon. There is no ifs, ands, or buts about it. There are no opt outs in that deal. There's a little bit of protection if he gets an elbow injury specifically next season. But ultimately, you're on the hook for $36 million for that guy, no matter what. Cody Bellinger at least has that potential for an opt out after this season. Unknown whether or not he's actually going to take that. But if he does end up taking it, then you're on the hook again for, I think it's another $53 million over the course of 2 seasons. And so, yes, I do think there will be a market for Cody Bellinger. I think that we've seen enough smoke around teams like the Seattle Mariners and the Philadelphia Phillies where you think that there is a team out there that is going to want to acquire a center fielder. But my big question for that is, are you going to get the value for Cody Bellinger that would reward you for moving off of that contract? I also have the same question about Jameson Tyon because, again, for every level of prospect that you go down in terms of what you'll accept in return for him, that's less money that you have to retain on that contract. So that's another question. And then you get to Nico Hoerner, and that's where I think ultimately the Cubs get to where they need to make a decision on whether or not they want to try to get value for a guy who certainly still has some, but at what cost? Because you bought into Nico Hoerner on the basis of being a competitive baseball team. And what kind of signal does that send that you're willing to pull the plug in year one of a 3-year contract extension for a player who can be a table setter at the top of your lineup, can be a Gold Glove caliber defender, and
Can be
does
a
that
shortstop.
can
Can
absolutely
still
play
be a
both shortstop.
shortstop.
And that's especially important with Dansby, Jason Hayward, Swanson at shortstop right now. I think
Oh my
ultimately,
God.
look, Leila, you want to compare stats to what Jason Hayward was putting up with the Cubs. Dansby, I'm going to whiff every other at bat. Swanson is basically at those levels right now. And so I shouldn't be overly flippant about Dansby Swanson, but we can agree he has struggled very badly this season, looks overmatched at the plate quite a
Yeah.
bit. And even
Yeah.
as the Cubs have been hitting better, he hasn't exactly been doing that himself. And so his performance leaves a lot to be desired. But I think ultimately what the point I'm trying to get at is that if you're seriously considering trading Nico Hoerner less than a year after signing him to a contract extension, that to me sends a horrific message about the direction of this team. And honestly, if Jed Hoyer is giving that a lot of very serious consideration, Tom Ricketts needs to give a lot of very serious consideration to whether or not this is the guy who's actually equipped to build this thing and to make this team competitive, because you don't pull the parachute on a guy like Nico Hoerner right now unless you have absolutely no idea what direction you are trying to steer this ship.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And by the way, the Cubs farm system is not exactly something that's like, vaunted and ballyhooed here. You don't have a ton of big league talent that you've drafted and developed and can be really proud of right now, and that you've even signed a second contract with your team.
Mm-hmm.
So to me, There are certain messages you send a room, man. And I feel like they did the right thing in that respect when they brought back Cody Bellinger, sure. But if you trade a guy like Nico Hoerner, that sends a scary message to people like Christopher Morel.
Mm-hmm.
I think it sends a scary message to even a guy like Michael Busch. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
anybody who's on the precipice of a possible deal with a team. I'm not talking necessarily next year, but for their future, and they're still developing, they're still not who they think they can be. That is this what's the goal here, right? Like, are you in triage? And if
Yep.
so, what are you trying to save? What's the heart? What's the lungs? To me, what's the brain you're trying to save? So that's a really scary and I think understandable question. I think about like the hardest trade for a team at the time where it was probably under a lot of scrutiny, and to me it always goes back to Garcia Parra.
Mm-hmm.
Interestingly enough, Boston to Chicago, but um, this is, I think it's different. You don't have as much talent on the roster, you know?
And I think ultimately then you do have to ask yourself, what kind of return are you looking for Nico Hoerner? Are you looking for a guy who's going to help you right now, or are you looking for a guy who's going to help you down the road? And to me, if you're looking for a guy merely to help you right now, I feel like you're better off waiting for Nico Hoerner to get kind of back up to Nico Hoerner levels of play, at least in terms of his batting average, but he's still playing really strong defense for you. As you mentioned, has positional versatility too, which is always great. And then he also steals bases like crazy. Like, that's not something you can ignore when you have a dearth of power hitting options. Now, if you can go out and get an immediate power upgrade in exchange for Nico Hoerner, which I struggle to identify a guy that they would end up being able to move for, that Nico Hoerner would be involved in that trade, then that's a discussion maybe you have. But if it's strictly we need a different guy that we're going to kind of move forward with and try to be competitive next season, I'm not honestly sure you get that deal done with Nico Hoerner. And then if that's not the discussion, then what are we even doing here? Then you've literally signed him for no good reason. And again, pretty damning indictment of the Jed Hoyer regime if that ends up being the logic applied in this case.
Yeah, and I know you questioned last year if the Cubs didn't make the playoffs, is David Ross's job in question?
Yeah.
Obviously it was. And that created a firestorm on social media. And I didn't, looking back at it, it's like, did it create a firestorm or were people just part of the discussion? And I feel like people just were part of the discussion. And
Oh boy.
ultimately we didn't, we saw what happened, right? And I feel like you're not the only person right now asking this about Jed Hoyer. I'm not there yet, but there seriously has to be some sort of referendum here. There has to be some sort of discussion as to what your process was and what you were thinking, because you've had to make a lot of also high profile DFAs to me. When you
Mm-hmm.
consider like Tucker Barnhart and Jan Gomes, and I know that sounds silly given the names, but it's how this team was going to depend on those people.
Yep.
And what's the situation going to be with Kyle Hendricks, regarding his back?
Yeah.
That's something that we can easily discuss when it comes to the decision the team made to bring him back, unfortunately, just because of the age and the injury problems previously. So all of this, I feel like, is a discussion that you either have at the trade deadline or you have it at the end of the season, but it's not pretty. And he's going to have to make some unpretty decisions moving forward, I think, personnel wise, in order to maybe get prettier later.
Leila, the Cubs currently have retained salary on 7 players. 7 players. And when you look at the number that you're talking about there, $7 million for Trey Mancini, $6 million for Jan Gomes, 3.5 for Tucker Barnhart, and then lower amounts for guys like Brad Boxberger, Garrett Cooper, Jose Cuas. But still, those are very real numbers and definitely prevent you from making moves and having flexibility when you're trying like hell not to go over the luxury tax. And so you want to add another little bit of fuel to the fire in terms of questioning Jed Hoyer. And lest we forget, next season is the last year on Jed Hoyer's contract with the Chicago Cubs. And so you do have to ask yourself, are you extending him this offseason, or are you cutting bait and moving on? I feel like this trade deadline and the way the Cubs approach it goes a long way toward answering that question in the way that I think we want to see it answered.
Additionally, what about the 1-for-1 trades? You mentioned Jose Cuas, or the, you let guys go who are now capable relievers on other teams like McGill. Yeah, I mean, all of this is worthy of a discussion. I think part of the problem, though, is think about when Theo left and what the assignment was for Hoyer once he got the job.
Mm-hmm.
It was clear the assignment was dump salary.
That was also post-COVID, to be fair, if we're going to talk about at least the business side of that.
Yeah, but I mean, don't you remember the absurdity of the discussion too when Theo left was, oh, what are the Cubs going to do with that money? Like, oh, are they going to spend it on the team? And even that was a really strange discussion if you want to speak about them in the terms of like the Dodgers and the
Right.
and the Yankees, which we want to speak about them. But then conversations like that let you know that that's not the case, right?
Right. Well, I mean,
Like looking back at it, I've thought about that too.
The reality is this is a big market. This should be a team behaving like a big market team. And again, dumping a guy like Nico Hoerner screams poverty franchise to me. And I hate that idea. The Cubs should not be acting like that. You shouldn't need to unload a bunch of really good assets and tear things down and rebuild every couple of years. That's not how a team like the Chicago Cubs should be built. They should be reloading. And that's ultimately, of course, not what we've seen from this team. And the second rebuild that they have attempted after getting rid of guys like Rizzo, Bryant, and Baez has not been a success, and it will not be a success if they end up trading guys like Nico Hoerner at the trade deadline.
Well, guess what, James and Mouse, your cat who's sitting next to you? One poverty franchise did something with their 1-1, and they have an outfielder, and they're both in the All-Star game. And that's more All-Stars than the Cubs can say now, isn't it? And they're ahead of them in the standings. Pittsburgh.
Mouse agrees with you. She's off camera, but certainly has many, many strong opinions about the Chicago Cubs. But I think ultimately we're going to get the All-Star weekend. By the way, have not even mentioned the fact the Cubs have to play the Orioles and the Cardinals this week ahead of that All-Star game. Who knows how that's all going to go?
Hey, remember that time they had to play two teams that are pretty good, one team very good?
I was going to say one team that's really dang good, and then one team
excellent
that's been playing a lot better lately, unfortunately. But we're not here to besmirch St. Louis at this time. What we're here to say is that the Cubs really need to kind of start showing something for sure now, with 3 weeks to go until the trade deadline. Then we can relax for a few days around the All-Star game and enjoy the festivities and hopefully watch Shota Imanaga go get some Dunkin' Donuts and kick some butt down there in Texas, and then evaluate whatever the heck we need to do in the final 2 weeks before the trade deadline. So, Leila, any final parting thoughts as we park this ship at the pier, so to speak?
Yes. Unfortunately, I feel like Dunkin' Donuts is a little bit harder to find in Texas. So I would suggest if you can find them, I don't know if they've gone that far north yet, but Shipley Donuts is a incredibly suitable alternative. The coffee situation is a little different, but I strongly recommend. Nobody's paying me to say that. I've given them a lot of my money over my life. So that would be a suggestion that I have. Other than that, let's go forth and hopefully enjoy the All-Star break next week. I'm sure we'll have some sort of pod with some observations.
I think that next week will be a good week for us to kind of let our hair down and maybe talk about some bigger picture topics with the Chicago Cubs and hopefully not have to break down anybody punching any walls. So with that parting shot, she is Leila Rahimi. I am James Neveau. Thank you guys so much for listening to the Cubs Talk podcast.
Congrats, you finished the video. If you want to build on that success, download the NBC Sports Chicago app. It's got highlights, exclusive insights, and push alerts tailored to you. Everything you need to be a real Chicago sports fan. Download it now.